This week's episode of the podcast was recorded on the 17th of August 2022 at home in Wicklow. And it is a juicy, meaty episode, mostly prompted by my watching Trainwreck, the documentary series on Netflix about the debacle that was Woodstock 99. The greedy cash grab that was the kind of Woodstock revival event that couldn't have been more distant from the heady, hippie peace and love days of 1969 and how it all blew up in the organisers' faces. I just watched that last weekend and found it gripping and compelling and unsettling and fascinating, thought-provoking, and it stirred up a few different thoughts, and so I explore them in this episode, and I look at what a zeitgeist might be, and when the kind of idea of generational zeitgeists clash or completely fail to see or recognize each other. And I found some different quotes from different sources that sort of take the analysis or my response to that event in different directions, and ideas about fatherhood and male role models, ideas about obedience, and ideas about love and how we behave together in large groups as opposed to how we behave in the privacy or intimacy of the company of just one other person. So quite a lot of stuff in the mix, and it just kind of teased itself out into being quite a lengthy episode. But I think I got into some interesting stuff. So I hope you can find the time to listen, and I hope you get something out of it, and I hope you let me know if you get something out of it and enjoyed it. So buckle up and get ready for a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff just around the corner. I will talk to you then. Cheers.
Ooh, not gonna change my mind, leaving the dream behind.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear, and you're listening to The Clear Out. Welcome. How's it going today? How are you? Check in with yourself there for a second. Touch base with yourself. Drop down to a lower gear and just go, how am I? Well, how are you? You frazzled? Are we living in frazzled times? Maybe. But we've just got to find a way. Got to find a way to push on through. What's the alternative? Is the alternative just opting out? Well, maybe that is something that is attractive. But there's ways to do that. There's ways to do that without having to completely abandon the rest of humanity. I think it veers into areas of wellness practice, healthful practices, just dropping down through the gears and de-stressing and bringing yourself into the present moment and trying to find a way to self-soothe, trying to find a way to hold yourself, to mind yourself, to ground yourself and just calm it all down. That's attainable. That's attainable. Every day you can try and bring that focus, that presence of mind, that presence of self, that presence of breath, that presence of the physicality. Feel the weight of your own body feel the sensations of existence in your being and observe. Observe and don't judge. Just be a living, breathing organism. And then get on with the rest of your day. Then dive headlong into the pool, the great cesspit of stress, of coexistence with the rest of grubby, stinky humanity. And do what you can. Do what you can to be a positive presence. That's not such a terrible aspiration, is it? So yes, here we are again. Another week has passed and another episode of The Clear Out is here. Welcome to the Tell. Welcome to the Tell. Explorations of wellness. That's what this is. It's looking at how we cope. It's trying to make sense of things. It's striving for that calmer place. It's striving for that reflective place. The place that buys us time, that buys us breathing space, that allows us to not completely freak out and panic and give in to the pressure, the maddening pressure of life in the 21st century. Where are we at? Where are we at? It seems we're certainly in my part of the world, in good old Ireland, which might also be your part of the world, but elsewhere as well, it would seem there's a financial crisis. If it's not looming, if it's not already here, it's looming. Inflation is rocketing, it would seem, certainly here and across the Irish Sea in good old England. It's rocketing there as well. So something is really out of whack. Something is off kilter. What is kilter? Can someone tell me that? Kilter. I'll tell you what, we'll be cheeky and we're just going to quickly look up kilter. What does kilter mean? Kilter definition is what we want, isn't it? Kilter. Off kilter, out of harmony or balance. What's the origin of kilter? Let's see what we got here. Order, good condition, in out of kilter from 1620s. Apparently a variant of English dialectal Kelter around 1600. Good condition, order, a word of unknown origin. Okay, off kilter, out of kilter, kilter. I wonder what that's connected to though. Yeah, okay. Oh well. So anyway, it does feel like that. And I don't know if this is the as my father likes to say, and I've quoted him here before, the crisis of capitalism is upon us. And if you want to hear more on that particular topic, you could do worse than go to the Adam Buxton podcast. One of his most recent episodes is an interview with an Italian economist and academic and author. Now, I'm going to go blank on her name. Her surname was like Mazzucato or something like that. It's quite a funny interview because he normally interviews people from the creative life, artists and performers and writers and comedians. And he's a great interviewer. He's a very intuitive, empathetic and interesting guy himself. And a funny guy. And very frank about his own stuff. But he, I won't say he ran aground in this interview, but he was up against a high functioning intellectual who was basically giving him a lesson in why capitalism is in such poor shape and needs to be tweaked. And one of my favourite points of the interview was when he tried to make a goofy joke and she didn't understand him, and it just stopped the interview dead in its tracks for a second. She was using the word vertical to refer to power structures in bureaucracy and governance and business. The idea being vertical chains of command don't serve efficiency well, and it's better to have horizontal communication, departments talking to each other. But in any case, he made some offhand silly joke about vertical, his understanding of vertical just being something that stands upright, and she was like in full flow and she just kind of stopped. And it's just one of those you're just kind of going, yep, that just really, you're not, this isn't your audience. She wasn't his audience. She's like, what? Excuse me? And he's like, it's just been funny. Anyway, it's nearly worth it just to hear that little tiny moment in, it's about an hour long. But she does go into some very interesting aspects of US financial management, I suppose, and economic management, and looking at how wealth could be distributed in a different way, or how governments can invest wealth in a different way. And yeah, interesting and educational if you're interested in that sort of thing. That's the Adam Buxton podcast, or maybe I'll just throw that link in the description. So tight times are coming, perhaps. Maybe that's what we're looking at. And maybe, I don't know, you've heard me say before on the podcast that it's certainly it's not like a wholehearted conviction. I'm not screaming it from the rooftops or anything, but I do feel we're living in an age of anxiety, and there is something about the sense of intensifying global warming. There's something about the sense of impending financial doom. There's definitely, and this pre-exists the pandemic, I believe, but the pandemic definitely exacerbated things, or accelerated the sense of anxiety, the sense of disconnect, the sense of powerlessness, helplessness, and of course we have the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and it's interesting, and we could have anticipated this, of course. It's interesting to see how that's fallen down the front page of the papers and the front page of the news websites, and it's become a smaller story. This is the nature, I think, of how we respond to prolonged conflict. And the initial reaction is one of intense alarm, concern, expressions of opinion, of support, of dissent, cries for help, cries for solutions, and then as it drags on and on and on, those voices become quieter. And certainly the media recognizes that perhaps people are looking for new stories. But anyway, it's still happening. There's still stuff going on in Ukraine. I haven't been following it closely, I'll be honest, and probably for some of those reasons I just mentioned. But all of these things, and this sense of an impending, as I said already, the impending financial crisis, which is going to pinch hard, causes for concern. And you put that into an economy like Ireland's, and a culture like Ireland's, and the relationship Irish people have to property and home ownership. And there's a whole other backstory there about the colonial impact on home ownership, property ownership, and the Irish obsession with owning owning your own place, so it can't be taken from you like it was historically. So you can't be booted out of your own home like Irish people were historically. That's in the mix as well. Yeah. So anyway, all of that is it's out there. It's out there percolating. So what do we do? What do we do to cope? Are we out on the streets protesting? Are we lobbying our political representatives to do better, to change policy, to put in place long-term vision? Are we just trying to what's the expression? I don't know. Gird our loins, feather our nests. Do you feather a nest? Is that even an expression? What am I trying to say? Stockpiling for our own future security, and to hell with everyone else. That's certainly a human characteristic, isn't it? I'm not sure how great we are with the old altruistic impulse. But in any case, it remains to be seen how things are going to pan out. And I'm a terrible one for the lack of a plan, which makes my wife want to murder me. I'm a day-to-day kind of guy. What's the weather like? Let's look outside and see. How do I feel? Let me just check in with myself. What am I doing? I don't know. And yeah, that gets old. That gets old. And there may have been a time when that was charming, when that was cute, when that was endearing. But 21 years later, it's lost its gloss. And yeah, I think my wife wants to serve papers. She's had enough. So I'll have to keep looking at that. I'll have to keep looking at that and see what my response is. But I won't know until I wake up tomorrow. In any case, there's a few different things I want to talk about today, and I will do my best to try and pull a thread through them. And in a way, this preamble, this prologue about the state of the world today, and there's undoubtedly things I've missed, it does tie into some of the ideas that are going to be raised, and it is something to do with the zeitgeist, the feeling of the times, where people's heads are at. But look, here's an interesting point. Well, I think it's interesting. It's an observation more than anything else. Zeitgeist is very generational, by which I mean, depending on where you're at in life, the zeitgeist is going to be less or more felt. It's going to be less or more present. Depending on where you are in life, you might be driving the zeitgeist, or you might be driven by the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist might leave you behind, and your perspective of the times might be way off. And of course, the older you get, past sort of middle adulthood, the less likely you are to really have your finger on the pulse, because often there's the feeling of the zeitgeist. It can often be a little bit pre-revolutionary. It can often be. It can, as much as it's a feeling of the times, I think it can often be the indicator of something new, and it can often be the barometer of a desire for change. I mean, that's the nature of time. We're never in the same time. We're never in the same moment. It's always new. Now, I think casually or anecdotally, or just trying to quickly put into your head a timeline through modern history, we can probably identify periods that were sort of zeitgeisty periods. And I think in the casual way of sort of revisionist history, or just glancing at a timeline, maybe we think, oh, well, that was like a 5-year or a 10-year period. I would argue it's probably shorter than that ever. Like, it doesn't last as long as that, but there's an intensity for a moment, and maybe that's a 6-month period, or a 1 year, or an 18-month, or a 2-year period. And there are changes in fashion, there are changes in music, there are changes in attitude, there are political changes, there are economic changes, there are changes in rights and what people are allowed to do, there are changes in what people tolerate, and there's changes in what people are able to do from a financial, economic point of view, and changes in priorities, changes in awareness, changes in the big issues of the moment. And all of these things tap into and define, dictate, drive a zeitgeist, or whatever that a zeitgeist is, whatever that atmosphere is, whatever that feeling, that instinct, that sort of that tempo, or that mode, or that sensibility. And I'm thinking about this because, and I'm going to kind of drop in. I'm going to drop in some quotes in today's episode. All quotes coming from my daily email, my Monday to Friday email I get from wordsmith.org. I've mentioned these guys before. I get a word a day email, a little etymological email giving you a word and its origin, its usage, and as always, at the bottom of the email is a little quote for a person whose birthday is or was on the day of the email, historically. Yeah, so I've got a few quotes to throw in today, and another couple from another source, and I'm going to try and weave these together in different ways. But before those quotes get dropped in, the main thing that's driving the topic today is the Netflix documentary that I guess was made last year but seems to have just come up on our screens. Is a 3-part documentary series called Trainwreck, which is about Woodstock 99. So this was a sort of a Woodstock revival festival organised by the same guy who organised the original Woodstock. Is it Michael Lang? He passed away. I think he only passed away last year, or in the last couple of years. So Michael Lang, the original Woodstock from 1969 was his baby, and that took place in those rolling hills of rural New York, and was obviously a huge moment, a huge cultural event, and it captured a counter-cultural unifying spirit which was connected to the hippie movement, which was connected to the anti-Vietnam War movement, and it gathered or attracted, was it 500,000 people over a weekend to Woodstock, who were very much aligned in their philosophies, their lifestyle choices, their sensibilities, their desire for the world to be a better place. And that was reflected by the artists who appeared at Woodstock, reflected by their own creative leanings, the types of songs they were singing, the lyrics they were writing, their own political and social leanings were very much aligned with the audience that was there, and it was massively significant and historic for a lot of reasons that make sense, that add up. And of course there was a values war going on there as well, and the hippie movement was a response to a couple of decades of conservatism, I suppose, a couple of days of what a very particular brand of American social conservatism, economic growth, economic stability. Of course, that would have been those preceding decades would have been post Second World War, a sort of a high time and a boom time for America, as being on the winning side of the war, coming back, the GI Bill, this period of growth coinciding with the sort of the TV age and advertising. The TV show Mad Men kind of tapped into that, and the kind of consolidation of an image America sold itself, and the unifying force built around very traditional, conservative family values, a very white vision of America, I suppose, and one that ultimately, to use a phrase I already used in this earlier in this episode, an image or a narrative or a story that ran aground in the 60s, when figures like JFK, his brother Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, these countercultural figures. I don't know if that's fair if that's a misnomer to describe JFK and his brother as countercultural figures, but they did represent something that was certainly on the surface, that was progressive, that was liberal, that was more inclusive, more embracing, more forward-looking, regardless of their personal agendas or their relationship to wanting power. They represented a threat to certain other forces in American society at that time, and that's definitely true for Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, who represented different facets and different expressions of the civil rights movement and a desire for black power and equal rights for black Americans. And it led, of course, into like that same period with all those men being assassinated. And that led into the Vietnam War, America's involvement there, and really the war that kind of broke America's confidence in its righteousness, certainly in the public domain, in how it was perceived. And it would have been a very big split in American society in terms of understanding the righteousness. You take a figure then like Muhammad Ali, who refused to be conscripted and just thought, like, why should I fight this white man's war in Vietnam when black Americans are being treated so badly back here? And of course that cost him his license to box for a few years. But I think history shows the moral courage and the correctness of his stance, and then coinciding with the sort of the hippie movement and flower power and alternative thinking and consciousness changing, and the loosening of the tie of conservative America, and the desire for a liberation, the desire for for peace and fluidity, and an alternative way of thinking about the world, and an alternative way, a sort of a way of offering a different type of power that wasn't built purely on economic pursuit or a capitalist idea of attainment, success, happiness. And that was huge. It wasn't a small thing. It was big and organic. And that's why Woodstock, the original Woodstock in 1969, was such a moment, because it seemed to encapsulate many of the positive aspects of that ideology or sensibility, lifestyle, whatever you want to call it. Then we cut to now in 1994, 25 years later, the same organizer, Michael Lang, tried to have another Woodstock, but it was washed out. It was just a mud fest, and it didn't hit. But 5 years later, again in 1999, he felt confident, it would seem. According to this documentary on Netflix, he felt confident, no, we can do it again. It's going to be great. And he teamed up with a music promoter, John Scher, I believe his name is, who was promoting some of the big musical acts of the time. And they, between them and a mysterious Irish, I don't even know what he is. Is he from? I think he's got a financial advisor background. Ozzy Kilkenny, Ozzy Kilkenny. This mysterious figure. I was trying to find out more information. He had a long-term relationship with U2 and U2's manager Paul McGuinness for about 10 years, I think, and then that ended in acrimony. But he was one of the other very significant figures behind Woodstock 99. He's featured very briefly in the documentary, but only on some archive footage from the time where he's been interviewed with John Scher and Michael Lang. But he doesn't feature in the documentary itself, but he's there and referred to as one of the three sort of, three guys, behind the brains trust of Woodstock 99. So if anybody wants to illuminate me on Ozzy Kilkenny, it's double S, so I keep on hesitating. Is it Ozzy or Ossie? Ossie? Who wants to be called Ossie? Anyway, he was there. This other dude, this Irishman, was in the mix. But in any case, the guy's first big mistake, it would seem, and go and watch the documentary. It's about 2 hours in total, 3 45-minute episodes. Their first big mistake was deciding that the perfect place to host this amazing weekend of music that was going to reignite the spirit of Woodstock from, let me just emphasize, from 30 years earlier. And this is why I'm talking about a zeitgeist and the feeling of the times. They chose, instead of rolling green hills, instead of a beautiful natural setting, trees and the abundance of nature's wealth, which was very in sync with the hippie movement and flower power and being at peace with nature and getting away from the industrial capitalist complex. The guys in 99 found a disused disused Air Force base in Rome, New York, which is basically acres and acres and acres of tarmac and airplane hangars. No shade, no trees, no green, no nothing. And this is where you kind of go, hold on a second. This guy who was behind the original concert, who presents himself continuously as this very sort of serene, hippie presence, where, it's all good and we just want to get the people together and let's all have a good time. And you can't help but go, hold on a second, what's this really about? It's about making money, and you're not really aligned with what you're talking about. And you just think about it. Where do hippies want to be? Not at any sort of military facility, disused or otherwise. So that was the first thing they did. And again, basically what the documentary does is it lays out their logistical errors, because they were so determined just to make a buck, and they outsourced their sanitation and water requirements, and they outsourced their food and drink providers, and the result was a very underserviced crowd, which was, I think, 400,000 people came for this weekend. And that's all fine. You go, okay, well, that's already going to be problematic. But what you do then is you throw into the mix, apart from that, so basically toilets that were unusable after a day or two, also water that then got infected with the overflow from the toilet, so drinking water and washing water that got infected with the overflow from these horrendously over pressurized portaloos. You also throw into the mix extreme heat. This like crazy hot weekend in, I think it was July 99. And then you go to the food providers and the guys who are selling water, and everything's overpriced. Which, of course, you go, well, of course, that's what happens at music festivals and events. But overpriced to such an extent that many of the attendees, who were by and large, I guess, from mid to late teens up to mid to late 20s, that sort of demographic predominantly, and they had already forked out $150 for their tickets, which was a lot of money then, and particularly if you're a student, high school or university student, or maybe early in your first job. And there was again, these things, they set a tone. And if you go back to the original Woodstock, people were making food for free because that was the vibe, man. And everyone was on board and it was all good. Now, there you have a couple of things in the mix, okay? Now, I said before that the original Woodstock, the musicians, the acts, the performers, everyone who went up on stage, they were in a sort of an alliance of sensibility, an alliance of philosophy with the crowd. Everyone was singing from the same sheet. In 1999, this wasn't the case. In 1999, most of the headline acts, it would seem, looking at the documentary, were all purveyors of a type of angry, noisy metal or rock, which was, again, from like an aesthetic point of view, angry music. Angry, aggressive, volatile, dark music, a lot of it. Two of the main headliners were Limp Bizkit and Korn. I couldn't name a single song by either band. But they were reflective of what was being channeled into the crowd, what was coming off the crowd. It seems there was something in the demographic that attended in 99 that was just restless and frustrated and angry and destructive and repressed, like deeply repressed emotion that needed an outlet. And let's just add to this lovely picture I'm painting that it seems, again, looking at the documentary, the vast majority of the crowd were white and male. And there was a sort of a frat boy energy. This messy, immature, amped up, aggressive dickhead, for want of a better word, kind of energy from these groups of young men. Now there were women there as well, and a lot of the women getting on board with the kind of the presented idea of, hey, this is Woodstock, hey, we're reigniting the hippie flame. A lot of young women going around bare-chested, having their breasts painted, and trying to be in that sort of pseudo flower power mode, and being, you know, loose and hedonistic, and trying to go with the spirit of what was being sold to them. And yet, looking around, there was very little else to support that idea. There was very little else around to support that sensibility. And just ultimately what happened, and if you watch the documentary, you'll see, it just became this weekend of nihilism. Nihilism. Let's try nihilism instead of nihilism. Nihilism. This weekend of, amorality, I suppose, and stepping away from the idea of collective care, stepping away from the idea of a harmonious, shared, humanistic vision for a better world. And after the first night, the place was just covered in litter, like just trash everywhere. And again, the documentary will reveal to you, because the sanitation, the garbage collection company that they'd organised basically weren't doing their job. And there was just this kind of like, why should we care attitude. But again, if you're surrounded by those conditions, it has an effect, it has an impact, it sends its own message. And again, you're kind of going, well, what's the driving energy? What are people responding to? So they're responding to their environment, and they're responding to the people around them. They're responding to the organisation of the event, and the evidence of care from the event organisers. And here's another thing in the mix. The vast majority of security guards they employed for the festival were just young kids, 18, 19, 20, untrained. And from the documentary, you get the clear depiction of some of those young people going, why should I care about what's going on? And maybe I can sell my security guard t-shirt for a nice little sum of money, because it'll give people access to all areas. And as the festival got on, the behaviour got worse and worse. And even, I think, on the second day, Sheryl Crow, not a hard rocker, but Sheryl Crow, Americana pop rock, I don't know how you would what category you would throw her into, but she had a couple of big songs, and a very successful album around that time. Was it what was it called? I want to say the Tuesday Night Social Club or something like that. I'm probably completely wrong there, but she was great. And it wasn't like I was a huge Sheryl Crow fan, but that would be more in my wheelhouse than the kind of the rockier, the metal stuff, the angry white guy music. Like so few faces of colour at this festival, you wouldn't believe it if you look back, see that footage now. You go, where are the black people? Where's anybody else who isn't white and young and white and male, as I said already. But anyway, Sheryl Crow gets up to play her set. I think it was on the Saturday in the middle of the day. Sun is beating down. And to just kind of capture the tone and the vibe of the crowd who were there for this like metal mosh pit music. And we're not talking about like long-haired rocker types. We're not talking about like AC/DC fans. It was a different thing. And it certainly wasn't a hippie thing. So Sheryl Crow gets up, you know, probably in the kind of peak of her career, looking amazing. And my ears may have deceived me, but the crowd shouted up, "Show us your nits." Now, maybe it wasn't nits. Now, if it was nits, I didn't see her scratching her head, so they weren't talking about head lice. So it could have been, I don't know, maybe she is an excellent, she's excellent with like needles and wool. Maybe she had a big bag of jumpers, or as we say in Ireland, gansies. And the crowd wanted to see her knitwear. Unless I misheard that and they said something else that rhymes with knits. I might have got that wrong. But that kind of seemed to be the tone of the crowd. The frat boy, beard up, obnoxious, aggressive, presumptuous young male in a group. The men in the herd vibe. So this is where I started to kind of think. I was kind of going, wow, what was going on? And I personally, I don't really remember that event happening. Now, one, I've never been a big concert goer. That's never been my relationship with the musicians that I've loved or listened to over the years. I got to go and see my two big outdoor concerts. I saw one when I was a teenager. It was David Bowie doing the Glass Spider tour, which was either 87 or 88, I think. And that was in Slane Castle, which is a big outdoor venue outside Dublin, for those of you who aren't Irish. And doing huge acts who've played there over the years. About 7 or 8 years later, around 1995, I saw REM play there with my then girlfriend, who was a big REM fan. So that was also at Slane Castle. So they were my two big, my two big outdoor concert festival events, and both very enjoyable. But it wasn't really where my my main drive was for events. So in 1999, I just moved back to Ireland after being in England for a couple of years at acting school, and I was just in that post-acting school headspace, very, very self-absorbed, trying to, in my mid-20s, just trying to work out what my next move should be, how I should go about trying to begin an acting career, sensing that my relationship at the time was coming to an end, working out a lot of stuff for myself in terms of my issues with my family, and trying to understand that role or that legacy, and just a very important time in my life in terms of just maturing and starting to get a sort of a nascent sense of self, coming out of a prolonged childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, where I really hadn't broken through the barriers of self and whatever the opposite of insight is. I mean, it's not delusion, but there's just there are limitations, there are blinders on that you're often not aware of. That's part of our personal evolution, I believe, and it was that was a key time in my life for just beginning to get a sense of, oh yeah, those blinders are there, and a lot of my understanding about the world and about myself, it's been a very limited view, and I was just beginning to try and prise those blinders off the sides of my head and expand my understanding without the use of drugs or anything else. So my mind in 1999 was a million miles away from this Woodstock revival event. But the expression, the clear expression of anger and unrest and disenchantment and the expression of a desire for chaos and destruction, it made itself felt more and more as the weekend went on, until on the final night when candles were handed out to the crowd so they could hold up lit candles. And there was one dissenting voice in the Woodstock crew who's featured quite a bit in the documentary, who was kind of going, this is the last thing that this crowd needs to be handed, is a tool of fire, which kind of speaks in a way to the primitive, primal, destructive urges that were seemingly rife in the crowd, because within moments the crowd had set fires, big fires around the venue, and it seemed to kick off just this rampage. And I read someone commenting on the Woodstock event, this one on 99, and basically kind of going, the people who were at the festival, they weren't interested in the values of 1969, and their behaviour was a big F-U to those values, to that generation. They hadn't bought in, and this was their way of expressing that. And if you listen to the music that was on stage with those big headliners each night, the music didn't reflect those values. There was nothing to tether them to the movement of 1969. There was no cohesive, unifying vision. Now, the headlining acts, this very white, male, angry guitar music, that's how I'm describing it. To me, that kind of rock, that kind of metal, it's always had and continues to have a very adolescent aspect to it. There's something about the explicit demonstration, the explicit acting out of, here's my anger, here's my rage, here's all my raw emotion, and I'm going to be absolutely demonstrative with it in the most literal, explicit way. To me, it's always, I've never been able to shake that conviction of that kind of binding force of that energy. To me, it's always in this kind of, the angry, and often male, the angry male adolescent energy. And there was an aesthetic that went with it, that you wore it. I remember being in school with guys who were into metal, and there was an aesthetic that went with it, so you were wearing it outwardly all the time. And it's not like I wasn't emotional. It wasn't like I didn't have issues coming out my ears. But I would, my preferred mode of expressing that was, to sit down with friends intimately and talk about my feelings, and express myself that way. And it seems I've always kind of been driven. My friendships have always had that kind of dynamic underpinning them. A willingness to be emotionally frank, a willingness to be vulnerable, with lots of other things that have nothing to do with that. A lot of other things that are just about shared sense of humour, or interest in exercise, sport, outdoor pursuits, whatever, and many other things as well. But to me, you see in the footage, Woodstock 99, that generation, and this is what I'm talking about, the zeitgeist and the generational thing and the clash. So you got these guys who organised the event, one of whom is this, in my opinion, a very disingenuous hippie one of whom is just a ruthless, hard-nosed business promoter. And they're trying to still talk the talk of 69 and, hey, we're all having a great time. Isn't this lovely? And just showed a complete lack of care, a complete lack of regard for the people who are at the festival, because they're generationally just removed. They aren't their fellow. They weren't their fellows. They were kids. It's 30 years later. These were their children. They could have been grandchildren in some cases. So there was no actual connection. There was no spiritual connection. And these guys were just trying to make a buck. And the way they organised the event reflected that. The lack of care, the lack of thoughtfulness, the lack of consideration. And ultimately, it blew up in their faces. And I'm interested in that aspect of it. So there you've got a failure of, we just wanted to make money, though we pretended it was about something else. And we didn't serve the needs of the people. And this is what happened. They tore down the structure that we built. They grabbed our festival and trampled it into the dirt. And some of the musicians and some of the performers were absolutely on board with that energy. It was like, release the darkness, release the madness, release the rage. Other performers were trying to go, hey, let's just calm it down. Let's get back to a place that's more about what this should be, which is a positive communal experience. But I'll tell you, and I haven't mentioned it yet, but of course there were a lot of incidents of sexual assault, and a lot of women who I'd say were terrified in that crowd. And look, let's be fair, there would have been women who had a great time and a great experience and felt cool and felt safe and weren't troubled. But definitely, and you get a sense of it watching the images from the documentary, again, that kind of aggressive, hyper sexed up energy of a lot of the men in the crowd was definitely at play. It was definitely in the mix. And I'm gonna give you one of my first quotes, okay? So this is a quote from Robert Greene Ingersoll, who was a lawyer and an orator from the 1800s. And he was an advocate of agnosticism, kind of humanistic philosophy, and of critical thought around the Bible. And he was a renowned public speaker, one of the most renowned public speakers in the USA in the late 19th century. And he wrote, amongst other things, and I love this title, he wrote a book called Some Mistakes of Moses. It's such a funny, kind of understated title. This is my book about some mistakes of Moses. I also have another book called Some Errors of Paul, and I have another one that's called Advice for Jesus. Just in case he's looking for some feedback. So anyway, his quote, and it ties in, I'm going to try and tie this into what we're talking about today. It has always seemed absurd to suppose that a God would choose for his companions during all eternity the dear souls whose highest and only ambition is to obey. You get that? It has always seemed absurd to suppose that a God would choose for his companions during all eternity the dear souls whose highest and only ambition is to obey. So here Robert Greene Ingersoll is casting an aspersion on probably the compliant nature of faith, the nature of faithful servitude and obedience. Now, I'm not going to reflect on that aspect of faith. I'm interested in throwing this into the mix of Woodstock 99. Now, in this case, to serve my purposes, you've got the godlike aloofness, the godlike arrogance of the organisers of the concert, of Woodstock 99, and they're disingenuous, posing as this is a lovely hippie event. We're all going to just kind of get on really well, and this will be a great memory for all the people who come here. And they completely misread their crowd because they weren't interested. They just thought this is a way to make a shitload of money. That was the driver. It's so clear from the documentary. The evidence supports this. And what you have then is these mortals basically refusing to obey, basically saying, we're going to take your shoddy festival and we're going to shove it back down your throats. And there will be no compliance. There will be no obedience. We're going to rain down fire on your offering. So that's, and then we have, put that into the context of zeitgeist and not reading the room and asking yourself, what do the kids want? And asking yourself, can I, if you're looking at your generation, can I impose my thing? Can I impose my sense of what the times are on others? And if you think Michael Lang, surely his zeitgeist was from 30 years earlier. And energy changes, sensibility changes, values change, and it's interesting because you think, and Robert Bly in his book Iron John, he taps into this a little bit. If you think the countercultural movement of the 60s was a rejection of very sort of traditional patriarchal values, conservative roles of masculinity, which were reflected in governance, in how the country was run, probably across the world of business, across gender roles, gender stereotypes, and the countercultural movement, which for the sake of argument, Woodstock embodied, which it rejected. And then what happens is you create space, like that rejection of the system creates space for something new to grow. So then you grow up with a generation of fathers who were effectively the kind of boomer generation. And you grow up with a generation of fathers, many, not all, of course, because not everyone falls into the same bracket. But there was probably a generation of fathers who decided, well, I'm not going to go down that patriarchal, conservative, traditional road of laying down the law and putting down guidelines and tracks, and this is how you got to live, and stand up straight, and fasten your tie and shine your shoes, and conduct yourself well in the world. Fathers maybe stepped away from that. Now, what does that leave you with? It leaves you then with a generation of children who are going, well, how should I behave then? Now, and again, this can't be right across the board, but for the sake of my thesis, when something is taken down, what replaces it? And why then do you get a generation of such angry young people or angry young men? And was there a failing of fatherhood? Was there a failing of parenting? And was that part of the downside of the countercultural revolution? Was that part of a downside of the sort of the hippie movement? I don't know. I'm just asking. You also have if you think, and I've got a quote that's going to tie into this as well, but I'll come back to that. Actually, in fact, I'll come back to that in a second. So I wanted to hit you with another very quick quote from Robert Greene Ingersoll, which I found when I was just looking up a bit of information about him. He has another quote, which you'll find out there amongst many social media platitudes. We rise by lifting others. That's quite nice, isn't it? We rise by lifting others. And I was thinking, well, what about the women who were lifted to crowd surf at Woodstock 99? Because you can see footage and photos of them desperately trying to cling onto their clothes as they're being groped and grabbed and mauled by these heaving, seething masses of young men who are passing them across the tops of their heads, and very darkly some of those women getting pulled down into the crowd. Again, you need to watch the documentary to see the full impact of that, and it isn't pretty. So here is another thing I'm going to throw into the mix of generations and zeitgeist, parenting, male role models, fathers. Listen to this. I hate with a murderous hatred those men who, having lived their youth, would send into war other youth, not lived, unfulfilled, to fight and die for them. The pride and cowardice of those old men, making their wars that boys must die. That's from Mary Roberts Reinhardt, who was an American novelist, considered the American Agatha Christie, famous as a crime novel author. Now, this is an interesting one because I think it's very easy to... Now, now let's be clear, she's not demonizing soldiers. She's not demonizing warfare as such, but she is expressing with murderous hate this idea that older men whose lives have been lived, whose youths have been spent, are still willing to send young men to war to fight their battles. That, I don't know. I mean, you can have very strong feelings about that. I can't help but feel, and maybe this is a bit connected to my martial arts background, there is something about the bond that comes with training together, with training hard, with putting yourself through tough times. And I'm not for a millisecond trying to create an equivalence between, martial arts training, which is largely for fitness, for personal discipline, even though there can be competitions in the mix. I'm not trying to make an equivalence between that and war. But there is a bond, and this would go across a lot of team sports and physical endeavors with others that present a physical and psychological challenge. If you do that with other people, you form a bond. If it's successful, if it's done well, if you overcome something together, I can't help but think when I look back, when I think back on different accounts of war, that apart from the dark side, the obvious dark side, and things like post-traumatic stress disorder and what soldiers have to deal with, male or female, on the other side of war, there is also something about there's something ennobling about going through that experience together. And I think actually Aaron Sorkin, in his in the character he created for A Few Good Men, which that was originally a play he wrote, and then it was presented in the movie A Few Good Men. That was his big kind of breakout, his breakout work. But he created a great character. He created a great character in Colonel Jessup, the Jack Nicholson character, who's the senior officer in command at Guantanamo, where the central event that drives the plot of the story takes place, where a young soldier is mistreated fatally, and Jack Nicholson's character finds himself ultimately being cross-examined by the young eager beaver lawyer Tom Cruise, who's trying to outgrow and emerge from the shadow of his father's legacy to become a credible courtroom lawyer. But Jack Nicholson's character sort of expresses the idea of the difficulty of the job and the vigilance of soldiers, and the courage of soldiers to do that job so other people can sleep safely at night. And he's a complex character, and he's a flawed character, but there's something in that, and it's typical of Aaron Sorkin's cleverness and his wordiness, and he expresses these ideas so well. But I think that does stand with me, that idea that as much as it's not a role, it's not a career I've ever considered or ever been drawn to, the military life, it can get demonized through the liberal lens, and certainly that was a huge part of the countercultural moment, and that was what was so challenging for so many soldiers who went to Vietnam and fought a really horrible and confronting war, the righteousness of which many questioned, and then lived with the horrors of that war, lived through the horrors of that war at great cost for many of them, at the ultimate cost for many of them, and then came back to an America that spat on them and rejected them and vilified them, and it was a real moment of crisis for the national character of America. Now, I'm trying to put this into the mix because there's a very big difference between that experience to the experience of GIs coming back from the Second World War as the victors of a just war, and how they could park that baggage, as much as the individual veterans would know the realities of war and the horribleness and would have recognised their fellow travellers on the other side of the conflict, that I guess all soldiers understand, which is why veterans of great wars sit together very easily with each other, it would seem, to relive that experience because of the shared trauma, the shared rite of passage. And again, they were young men, and incredibly emotional. It's an incredibly emotional legacy, and incredibly emotional burden to carry, I think, for many soldiers. But imagine how much worse that burden is if you have been demonized for your participation in the particular war you were involved in. Now, I'm trying to drag this back into fathers and sons and the roles men are offered to fulfill. And so you have the righteousness of the GIs from the Second World War, and then there was the Korea War, I guess. And again, this is, it's American because it's connected to Woodstock. And then you go to the Vietnam War, and it's like, no, that wasn't just. And the conflict that presents. And like, I found myself thinking, looking at those men at Woodstock 99, like, were these young men, and this is, I'm asking this just for the sake of the problematic nature of the question, do all young men need to fight a war? And maybe some young women too. And then we're getting into this area of of gender stereotyping and who should do what and who is best suited to do what. But when you look at that anger of that crowd and the dangerousness, the volatility of that crowd at Woodstock 99 and their general age profile, and you think, were those young men in need of stronger parenting, stronger fathering, so to speak, stronger male role models? Were they in need of a unifying and ennobling experience that would bring them together in a way that would, as I say, lift them, edify them, bring them to a point of maturation that meant they wouldn't go down the road they went down at Woodstock 99. And let me just be 100% clear here. I'm not trying to say that all young men should go into a military experience. But in a way, you wonder, like, metaphorically, is that something? Is there a war that we all have to fight to earn our to earn our maturity. I mean, and I suppose, I mean, I spoke about this a few episodes ago. I can't remember which one it was, but the idea of rites of passage, that's the idea of a rite of passage, to go through something that is altering, to go through something that is changing, to go through something that brings you to a new status in society, that you go through something the other side of which presents you with an opportunity to be valued more by society. And if you do not go through that, or if that experience does not exist for you in society, what happens to you? Are you in a state of permanent adolescence? Are you in a state of permanent pre-maturation? And then you carry that sense of unfulfillment through adulthood. So that's taken me a long time to get to what I think is a really good point. So, yeah, and here, okay. And again, just because I'm looking at the time and I'm trying to not go too long on this, but I knew this was going to get a bit meaty. Here's the third quote. And this one, again, is going to speak to some of that behaviour at Woodstock 99. Listen to this. We perceive when love begins and when it declines by our embarrassment when alone together. That is a quote from Jean de la Bruyère, an essayist and moralist from the 17th century, French, and he was considered a satiric moralist who was known for, I think he only had one significant work, which was called The Characters, also known by the subtitle The Manners of the Age, from 1688, which was published late in his life. But it was so popular. And basically, from what I read online, the idea behind that book was he would describe a certain human characteristic, and then he'd illustrate it by describing the behaviour of a figure who remained anonymous, but who the readers of the book would then, at the time, would frantically try to unmask the anonymous figure who embodied that particular personality trait. And it was, I guess, sort of salacious and scandalous and gossipy and mischievous, but hugely popular. And I think it had more than one edition. But that quote, I think, is absolutely brilliant. We perceive when love begins and when it declines by our embarrassment when alone together. And there's something about that idea of discomfort with somebody that you're attracted to at the beginning of a relationship. And then a different kind of discomfort and awkwardness when it's at the end of love. And I find that quite poignant in its way. But I'm going to return. I've got one final one to go to. That's not from wordsmith.org, which we'll return to this idea because I only read it today and I found it very thought-provoking. But if this key idea, and this is going to tie it back to Woodstock 99, our embarrassment when alone together. So just think about that idea. Think about how exposed you can be in the eyes of one other person. Yeah? And the intensity of that intimacy, the intensity of that privacy, the no hiding place of that moment, and therefore the discomfort, the potential discomfort, therefore the potential awkwardness, therefore the potential emotional nudity, the emotional exposure. And then you go to the opposite idea of being in a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people, and the opposite of intimacy, the opposite of exposure in that sense, the opposite of real knowledge of the person beside you, but rather this vast anonymizing energy where there's a barometer of tolerance that is being dictated by so many people around you that pulled you into the herd, unless you're an individual of enormous courage or enormous restraint or of enormous personal conviction. And when that energy is dark and destructive, what the hell are you going to do? I mean, are you powerless to resist? Because that's what you watch the documentary Woodstock 99, and that's what a lot of the commentators are saying, that there was a vibe and an energy in the crowd that was like it was like a tinderbox. This is going to kick off. This is going to just explode in the worst possible way. And they were all right. Now, maybe they're all being very clever after the fact, but I don't think so. It seems very genuine how they felt at the time and what they're expressing in the documentary. But that's what I was thinking. The idea when, you're not alone and the crowd dictates what is permissible. Now, again, go back a few episodes and I spoke about the ideas of tolerance in society. But you know what? A festival isn't. A festival isn't society. People go to festivals to let their hair down. They go to festivals so they can get messed up, so they can listen to music, so they can take drugs, so they can drink. And don't get me wrong, I know, I'm fully aware there are festivals out there that are not about alcohol, they're not about drugs. But for many people, that's what going to the big festival is about. That's what, you go back to the 90s, one of the big annual events in Ireland was the Trip to Tip. Fela, this rock concert, this festival concert that would happen over a weekend in the summer. I think I spent the summer in America in 1990, and I think that might have been the first year of this festival that happened in Tipperary. Was it in Thurles? Is that right? And my friends went, and that's all they were talking about when I came back from America, and they were regaling me with the hit song from the Saw Doctors. I wish I was on the N17, and I was like, what the hell? Am I delighted I missed this? Am I sorry I missed it? But it does, and of course it does attract young people, because in a way maybe festivals became the rite of passage that I've been lamenting the absence of. But then you question, what kind of rite of passage is it? Because ultimately, and maybe here is the key distinction, a rite of passage, while it may be extreme, while it may be dangerous, a rite of passage typically takes place under controlled conditions. And that, of course, is a relative term. So it depends on the culture, it depends on the history, it depends on the tradition, it depends on the society. But a rite of passage typically takes place in controlled conditions. And those conditions are there to facilitate an experience and to facilitate a desired end result. Now, if a festival is basically a place where kids go to get away from their parents, and I'm using those words metaphorically, okay? Because I think that still can be the energy of a festival, even though there are family-friendly ones where kids can go too, in a literal sense. But the idea of a festival for many people is that that's where young people go to get away from the prying eyes, the forbidding eyes, the censoring eyes of parents, of teachers, of bosses, of police, of society. And you're all there together, and the unwritten rule is we can do what we want. And if that all happens in balance with a certain harmony and a certain positive energy, and enjoying, the music and enjoying the facilities and enjoying each other, by and large, they're really positive experiences. But what Woodstock 99 shows you is when it goes pear-shaped, it can go really pear-shaped, really wrong, and be no fun at all. Okay, so I've got one final quote. It's long, and it's from Joni Mitchell, and I just saw it on. I just saw it today on social media. A friend shared it on social media, and I just thought it was really interesting. And in fact, I have two Joni Mitchell quotes, because I found myself wondering after looking at this lovely quote from Joni Mitchell. I was trying to remember, had she performed at the original Woodstock? I mean, I've seen the Woodstock concert from the 1969 Woodstock. I've seen all of it once, bits of it many times. And Joni Mitchell wasn't at Woodstock, but she wrote a very famous song about Woodstock, inspired by what Graham Nash from Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young shared with her. And the chorus of her song Woodstock, which was written, I think, within months of the actual festival. The quote from Joni Mitchell from that song, the chorus is, "We are stardust, we are golden, we've got to get ourselves back to the garden." That's it, very simple. We are stardust, we are golden, we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. Now you think of that, those three ideas: stardust, golden, get back to the garden. It really epitomizes something at the heart of the hippie ethos. That we're pure, that we're radiant, and that we're about nature. We're something natural. We're something that should be in harmony with the universe. And we need to get ourselves back to something pure and beautiful, natural, divine, maybe in the sense of humanity rather than the idea of faith or a patriarchal God. And then you try and put that idea, so beautifully expressed by Joni Mitchell, put that idea against what Woodstock 99 was. There was no garden, and there was concrete, there was tarmac, there was the energy of a military complex, there was the energy of that music, and there was very little about it that fed into these kind of pastoral ideas of the natural aesthetic and harmony with the world. So that's a nice little one from Joni. But let me just hit you with this longer one from Joni that I came across today for the first time. I don't know from when. I gather a relatively recent quote. And this is Joni Mitchell on monogamy. And let's just, so monogamy and love fundamentally. So listen to this. This is really great, and I'll finish with this, okay? So she said, I don't know if I've learned anything yet. I did learn how to have a happy home, but I consider myself fortunate in that regard because I could have rolled right by it. Everybody has a superficial side and a deep side. But this culture, and I presume she's talking about American culture, this culture doesn't place much value on depth. We don't have shamans or soothsayers, and depth isn't encouraged or understood. Surrounded by this shallow, glossy society, we develop a shallow side too, and we become attracted to fluff. That's reflected in the fact that this culture sets up an addiction to romance based on insecurity. The uncertainty of whether or not you're truly united with the object of your obsession is the rush people get hooked on. I've seen this pattern so much in myself and my friends, and some people never get off that line. But along with developing my superficial side, I always nurtured a deeper longing. So even when I was falling into the trap of that other kind of love, I was hip to what I was doing. I recently read an article in Esquire magazine called The End of Sex that said something that struck me as very true. It said, if you want endless repetition, see a lot of different people. If you want infinite variety, stay with one. What happens when you date is you run all your best moves and tell all your best stories. And in a way, that routine is a method for falling in love with yourself over and over. You can't do that with a long-time mate because he knows all that old material. With a long relationship, things die, then are rekindled. And that shared process of rebirth deepens the love. It's hard work though. And a lot of people run at the first sign of trouble. You're with this person and suddenly you look like an asshole to them, or they look like an asshole to you. It's unpleasant. But if you can get through it, you get closer. And you learn a way of loving that's different from the neurotic love enshrined in movies. It's warmer and has more padding to it. Joni, you are a goddess of wisdom. Isn't that just fantastic? I absolutely love that. So lovely. Now, Joni surely is one of the originals. Surely one of the original hippies. Such a unique, distinctive, wonderful artist, songwriter, woman. Thank you, Joni. None of that, none of what she just said chimed with the energy from Woodstock 99. Ah, dear. So, alone together. Alone together. That's what it's about. And in a way, we're all alone together in this massive, heaving mess of humanity, on this ball spinning in the universe that we share and should care for so much more than we do. So let's not live on the tarmac. Let's not have our festivals in the hangar. Let's be kind. Let's mind ourselves. Let's take responsibility for each other, maybe. That's my hippie sentiment. In whatever small ways we can. It's not about going out and saving the world all by yourself. You're going to burn out in the first couple of hours. Be sensible. Measure out your energy. Leave some for yourself or you're going to be useless to everyone, most of all yourself. That's my little bit of wisdom for you there at the end. Okay, there you go. I got through most of it, I think. Thank you so much for listening. I never don't feel grateful for any of you who are out there listening. I really appreciate it. And tune in again next week where there'll be more. And as I said, I'll be going to try to. I'm lining up some more interviews. They'll be coming down the track, and other things in the pipeline as well. So there you go. We're done. That ended up being quite a long one. I'll talk to you real soon. I'll probably talk to you this time next week if you're a regular listener. Otherwise, you'll just happen along on the podcast Spaghetti Junction, and you might pick mine up. You can find me on social media. The Clear Out Podcast is on Twitter. No, it's not. The Clear Out Podcast, by that name, is on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, The Clear Out Podcast. Otherwise, The Clear Out 2, and that is the number 2, the digit 2. The Clear Out 2 is on Twitter. You can email me at theclearoutlive@gmail.com. And if you want to contribute to this podcast, this independent podcast, this product of one middle-aged, white, straight man who's trying to put out a bit of positive energy into the world, you can do so. You can support it. You can use the supporter link, which should be there somewhere in the description. Or you can become a regular contributor, a patron of the show, using the Patreon link. That's www.patreon.com/theclearout. And maybe you can become one of the new patrons of the show and get pushy in your requests for what you'd like on the Clear Out, the podcast that is dedicated to wellness with attitude. Okay, I'll leave you with that. Thanks again for listening. Do take care of yourselves. Do mind yourselves. And I will see you soon. I'll be here next week for more more of the tell. And I hope you'll be there too. Okay, take it easy. Talk to you soon. All the best. Bye.